Um, I really like that question because can often be very cynical about AI, and there are issues to be cynical about it, but there is a lot of benefits. It can speed up processes and make processes a lot more efficient, and help augment people in their roles and their decision making, provided, of course, we understand how those algorithms make their decisions and that they are transparent and we understand them. So a classic example that I think is a really good example about the correct way to deploy algorithms, particularly diagnostic algorithms, for example, in healthcare, was an algorithm that could diagnose breast cancer. And you get the reports more accurately than radiographers, which is dubious. And it's usually only by a few percentage as well. And what you find with that is if you deploy it really correctly, so in the UK, for example, we have a 2-view system when you look at x-rays and MRIs of breast cancer tissue, and 2 consultants have to look at it. Now that's a very slow process, and so if you have one, it runs through the algorithm in this image recognition, and it can flag up the ones with high probability that there might be cancer. Then you can have a viewpoint of a radiographer look at it, and then you've still got that 2-view process, and it speeds the whole issue up. Now you can think also, particularly with healthcare as well, and that maybe you can start doing some diagnosis from a distance. You can start self-reporting symptoms, and an algorithm can check all of that and make recommendations. But I will always say that these have to be machine in the loop processes, not human in the loop processes, which gets mentioned, where we have to be aware that there always has to be a human oversight, and we all have to understand how the algorithm is working, because they are not perfect, and they are not foolproof, and they are not objective, because they work based upon the data we have fed into them, and trained and tested those algorithms on. And that data is historic data that humans have collected, or have decided that sort of data needs to be collected, and therefore that you're going to have biases in there. So whole processes it'll just speed up and make things a lot easier. It should not, though, ever replace human contact and human behaviour. That's my one issue.
Because that's the I suppose if you were to take a section of people and sort of quiz them on this, that there may be the perception of, that there could be a fear, there could be pitfalls. I mean, typically, what sort of, what are those aspects of those fears and sort of pitfalls that you've experienced that you can kind of help alleviate, I suppose?
Well, they're justified. I mean, going back to the example that I gave you before, with the 2-view process with an image recognition algorithm for breast cancer, it is more accurate with a 2-view system. It's actually less accurate if you just use it on its own. And that's the key thing. And so it shouldn't replace people in work. And it's this understanding of the accuracy levels I personally feel is an issue, and how they can be misused and changing the use case. So a really well-known example is the Allegheny child welfare tool that a lot of organisations and councils, and some now beginning in the UK as well, use to screen and risk assess incoming calls of potential child abuse and child neglect. And so what you get with these things is you get these calls coming in, and people take in the information, they feed the information into the algorithm will run its system over it, assessing the risk and knowing from historically what variables are most likely to be most important as to whether this particular case coming in is likely to be worthy of a home visit, which is what that was for. And what happens with those is people start to default to them, and the algorithm is given a risk assessment of 20, for example. Now that process is going in, until you find out though that actually those algorithms are only 60% accurate, and no more accurate in many cases than untrained individuals making a decision. So Compass was one that decided on post-sentencing decision making in the States, and again, no more accurate than untrained individuals looking at someone's details, and you actually do not know how the decision making is happened, and so you start defaulting to these algorithms which are not accurate. They're even less accurate if you're dealing with particular demographics, and come actually very discriminatory and biased. So you can embed inequality in the system. And my particular concern is you can result in de-skilling, because that experience that people have on real life experience and the high level of skill that they have, if they're constantly defaulting to the algorithm to make the final decision, decision is off of them as well, so they can blame the computer, and they become de-skilled. And a classic use case, example of this for all people working within this field is to look at the avionics, the aviation industry, and how, because they've been dealing with automation for quite a while, but if something goes wrong there, a plane crashes, and you can't cover that up. So they've responded to the problems of automation and de-skilling of pilots to make sure, and they've put in actual working protocols and processes in place to make sure that can be overcome. So
so there is some truths then in that, how that there can be data bias, and also you can indirectly discriminate, can't you, against some some truths, I suppose.
Yeah, and it defaults to other human biases. Going back to Compass, for example, if you were black and male, you were more likely to have a heavier sentence and not be paroled and so on than a white male. There's this risk assessment that they do, and we have them in the UK as well. And even when you try and debias your data sets, and so you've got this issue of, well, if we find that postcodes is actually a proxy for race, because people tend to live within the same communities in the same areas. So even if we take race out and we include postcode, you still have what's called proxy features, where you can actually identify people based upon their race or their age or their gender. And even if you take the postcode out, there are so many, it's so complex that you can still have that in. And some people argue, well, if we try and completely debias our data set, you still find that you still get bias, but now we can't tell where it is. So sometimes it's better to leave those features in rather than leave them out and process it anyway. But of course, under GDPR, this idea of processing of personal features and sensitive features isn't actually allowed either. So it's a complex process, but my worry is that people don't understand this, and people who are deploying these systems are a little bit bedazzled by the potential, which is fantastic, but don't deploy them in the correct way and in the correct processes, such as within the aviation industry. And it's such a shame, because if they're done in the correct way, they can actually really be helpful. If they're done incorrectly, they can actually have some short-term damage, such as discrimination, and long-term consequences, such as de-skilling of the workforce. So people need to understand this, and to move away from just data bias as well. I'll cut short, but the thing is, a lot of people think that the problems with algorithms and the bias is because of biased data sets, but that isn't just the case. There's a whole process of decision making all the way through when you're developing an algorithm, including what features you do, what weightings, and then what threshold levels you set post algorithmic processing as to when you might want to, for example, make a decision. Do you want to set it at the threshold at 70% probability, 80% probability, and things called false positives and false negatives? Which is the most dangerous one, the most harmful one, and which one do we want to reduce? And when you play around with those, it changes your accuracy levels. So there's a lot of decision making in there, and it's not just purely the data. So fixing your data is good, but it's not the only issue, and people need to understand this.
Yeah, it's been wonderful listening to you. Thank you so much. All right, and we'll catch up soon.
I know, it's always quick, isn't it? 10 minutes is never enough.